Arthur Miller's 1952 play The Crucible and Franz Kafka's 1914 short story In the Penal Colony are two texts which intelligibly depict draconian laws and regulations. Miller wrote The Crucible during a time of McCarthyism and communist purging, whilst Kafka wrote In the Penal Colony against a background of the tumultuous events of World War I. The illustration of draconian laws and capital punishment being seen as the only possible verdict, regardless of the gravity of the offence, can challenge one's assumptions about the nature of punishment and redemption through the impact on the characters in both texts, John Proctor and the officer, and allows the reader to critically question their beliefs. Should justice and punishment be based on a rigid adherence to a set of traditional doctrines? Can one be redeemed through the notion of capital punishment? Can we assume the judicial system knows what's best for us? The tendency for judicial corruption is examined in both texts. Both societies in the Crucible and in the Penal Colony have rigid and inflexible bases for their justice systems. The Crucible depicts a legalistic and narrow interpretation of Old Testament law, and in the Penal Colony a traditional draconian legal system based on a set of outdated doctrines from a figure called the Old Commandant, who instructs for the condemned to be violently executed by a machine called the apparatus. In both cases, accusation is, effectively, condemnation. There is no escape for the individual who has been brought into the court system. In the Crucible, it is the innocent who are condemned and the mendacious who are believed. In Act 3 of the play, Danforth states that a person is either with the court or he must be counted against it. The motif of binaries existing throughout the play expound the fact that draconian laws can be categorized as inflexible, obstinate, and completely disregard the grey area present in the human experience. Danforth, being an allusion to McCarthy himself, is more concerned with his public reputation than delivering justice, an idea exemplified through the authoritarian dialogue, "I should hang 10,000 men that dare rise against the law." The hyperbolic language solidifies the idea that Danforth's justice is a cause to all the carnage in Salem. This idea of injustice is further shown in Kafka's In the Penal Colony, a fictional penal island set in the early 20th century in which prisoners are exiled to. The apparatus, the machine used for execution, performs like the hand of some inexorable power, whose primitive function is reflected in the stark landscape surrounding it and contrasted with civilization. The officer claims that the executions are humane, but compares the machine for execution with a pigsty. "My machine's as filthy as a pigsty." The use of bestial language makes the reader think of animals, underscoring that condemned persons are treated more like animals than people. In The Crucible and in the Penal Colony, both authors use dramatic and situational irony to critique the effectiveness of draconian laws and capital punishment in relation to justice and redemption of those condemned. A prominent character in The Crucible, Reverend Hell, is first introduced to the reader with the appearance of being loaded down with half a dozen heavy books. The symbolic stage directions act as a metaphor for being weighed down by religion, an idea which is reflected in Tyler's impartiality and justice. Moreover, Hell's description of the books is highly emblematic, shown through Hell's meta-language. "Here is all the invisible world, defined, and I mean to crush him, the devil, utterly, if he has shown his face." The dialogue symbolizes American tradition of establishing draconian laws based on superstition and paranoia, and shows how methodically organized totalitarian governments are, something Miller experienced living as a prominent academic in McCarthy's America. Hell expects the books to be used to redeem the truth and have justice. Thus, this metaphor is exceedingly ironic. Moreover, irony is effectively used in the Penal Colony as a tool to critique the injustices of draconian laws. One can observe this through the situational irony regarding the felt. The officer is frustrated when the condemned man vomits after tasting the felt, and adds in a pitying tone, "How can anyone take this felt into his mouth without feeling disgusted? Something that 100 men have sucked and bitten on as they were dying." For the officer, evincing compassion for the condemned man is ironic, given the fact that he is about to inflict a horrifically brutal punishment on a man for a negligible crime. The officer's concern about the dirty felt seems absurd when a man's body is about to be mutilated in the most grotesque and painful fashion. With this simple example of irony, Kafka demonstrates the absurdity of this draconian system and its apologists. Both The Crucible and In the Penal Colony employ paradoxical characters in their narratives to illustrate the complex nature of redemption. One of the axes upon which the play turns is Elizabeth's refusal to forgive John for his adultery with Abigail. She says she has forgiven him, but her actions and attitude refute that. This is elucidated in Proctor's poignant dialogue, "An everlasting funeral marches around your heart. Every moment judge for lies, as though I come into a court when I come into this house." The lexical field of court and judgment highlights how oppressive religious societies, such as the Puritans, represses sexual digression and free speech in general. Proctor's fatal flaw is his lust for Abigail Williams, which ultimately acts as an incentive for the hysteria and lies that take place in Salem. However, Proctor redeems himself through sacrifice, and by the end of the play is more concerned with his personal integrity than his public reputation. His sacrifice exposes the anomaly of pursuing truth rather than self-preservation. Proctor's paradox in emotions is encapsulated in the emotional stage directions. He is weeping in fury, but erect. The contrasting verbs present are indicative of how through his vulnerability, Proctor is granted with his truth, and thus his redemption. It is in this moment which Elizabeth forgives her husband's act of lechery, the play ending with Elizabeth saying to Hale, "He has his goodness now. God forbid I take it from him." Like John Proctor, the officer in the penal colony is paradoxical in nature. From the beginning of the text, the officer appears to be in a position of power. His importance and authority are accentuated by the fact that he retains the diagrams of the apparatus given to him personally by the old commandant. He inflicts harsh capital punishment on others for committing minor crimes and lives by the declared maxim, "Guilt is never to be doubted." It is thus surprising that after the voyager visiting the penal colony explains that he will not condone the apparatus, the officer calmly prepares it for himself. Instead of being in the position of executing others, he will now be executed himself. With the officer choosing the words, "be just," to be carved on his back, the machine malfunctions and instantly kills him. The destruction of the apparatus and death of the officer seem to stand as an indispensable prerequisite for any change towards a more rational and humanitarian system and the annihilation of archaic law. In essence, both The Crucible and In the Penal Colony are two texts which illustrate how the representation of the impact of draconian laws and regulations challenge societal assumptions about punishment and redemption through exploring the notions of injustice, irony, and paradoxes. Both of the text's contexts are reflected in the overarching themes, techniques, and structures, and are crucial when analysing the text from a viewpoint of justice and fairness.